Have you been told you're too sensitive or you think too much? Do you wonder, what is wrong with me? Nothing, according to the Gentle Souls Revolution. After a 5-year cultic misadventure in a secret school, author Esther Friedman wrote her cautionary tale. Memoir led to research on narcissistic abuse and a recovery template for empaths. With humour and compassion, Friedman describes how the cult exploited her empathy. She interviews former members from other cults and includes research from leading experts. We learned that all cults and cons market false hope by leveraging human nature to profit from the vulnerable. This revolution teaches gentle souls to self-protect by accepting the existence of and learning to identify pathological selfishness. Recovery requires valuing your proclivities and protecting them like priceless gems. When you do that, those vulnerabilities can become your greatest strengths. That is, the Gentle Souls Revolution. Hello listeners, and welcome to this week's mini-series with returning guest and friend of the Cult Vault podcast, Esther Friedman. I'm your speaker, Casey, and some of you may remember Esther from episodes 161 and 182, where we discussed at length Esther's experience in the secret school often referred to as Odyssey study group. Back to talk to us about her powerful memoir, I am so grateful to work again with Esther Friedman. Before we jump into things, on September 16th, 2023, it's just been confirmed that I will be live at CrimeCon in Glasgow giving a talk on the big stage with guest speaker Bexy Cameron to talk to her about her life in the Children of God, her work as an author, activist and filmmaker, as well as her recently published memoir Cult Following. For 10% off tickets today, you can visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout. I am so excited to showcase this talk and meet with Bexy, who will also be doing book signings. CrimeCon is the UK's largest true crime event sponsored by CBS Reality, with leading figures in the field giving panels and talks, where guests have the chance to mingle with the greatest minds in criminology and beyond. I hope to see you there. Also, for access to full-length ad-free episodes ahead of each Friday's release, you can visit patreon.com/thecultvault and support the show from only £1 a month. Thank you so much to those who are already supporting this important work. But for now, here is Esther Friedman. So hello, Esther, and welcome back to the show. I'm really excited to share the news of your recent publication with the listeners and catch up with you about your life and your work. Would you like to start by reintroducing yourself to the listeners?
Sure. Casey, thank you for having me again. It's always fun to talk to you. My name is Esther Friedman. I am a therapist who works in the cult recovery world, or cultiverse, as we like to call it. I am just releasing a book called The Gentle Souls Revolution. I ended up here because, of course, I had my own misadventure in a cult, as we like to call it. And I think that's enough for now.
I love the term misadventure. People that listen regularly will have either heard you use it in our first talk
Mhm.
or will have heard me say across various episodes, oh, Esther Friedman, who I spoke to one time, uses the phrase misadventure. I just absolutely love it. I feel like it really takes away any blame that a person might put on themselves, and that's really important with the work that we're doing, of course, and adds an element of kind of casualness, and I don't think that there's much of that in this realm. Of course, the
Yeah.
subject matter is very heavy. Your experiences are particularly in some parts pretty heavy. So misadventure is kind of like allowing people to come in to this circle and hear this story, and so I use that all the time. So this is Esther Friedman, everybody. She's here to talk to us about her misadventure with the Odyssey study group. So we have discussed this before. I've spoken to you, I've spoken to Spencer Schneider, author of Manhattan Cult Story and good friend of the podcast, who
Mhm.
calls you Queen Esther. And if you're listening, hello, Spencer. We love
Hello,
you.
Spencer. Or Sir Spence, as I like to call him.
Sir Spencer, Queen Esther. I love it. The
The
queens of
night.
the queens of the revolution.
Yes.
Can you give us a brief summary of the history of the Odyssey study group?
Sure. Before I forget to Casey, I love that we talk about this word misadventure because I do use it intentionally to lighten the load, to strip away the blame. And it is kind of funny. So, um, so the history. I just wanted to remember to say that before I got into the history. So, as I understand it, the Odyssey study group began in the late 60s, early 70s, Northern California, San Francisco area, groovy hippie, everyone getting stone time, right? By a man named Alex Horn who fancied himself a playwright. Um, Critics disagreed with him, but he fancied himself a playwright. And it went through several iterations. For a while, it was on a ranch, and then it became the Theater of All Possibilities. And I think there was a different theater in between. I can't quite remember. Um, they used to aggressively sell tickets to, I guess, what were like just terrible plays. The people who were members of this so-called theater group, they had to sell a certain amount of tickets, and they would go out and aggressively try to sell to people on the streets. And in the meantime, they were coupling up, they were having kids, and the kids were being neglected. Essentially, the San Francisco press started to investigate this weird group. There's a bunch of articles from the 70s in the San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner. At this point, Alex Horn was married to Sharon Gans Horn. They shut the theater down. They migrated across the country, landed in New York City, and I guess Boston, which is where I am, and sprouted up, in a different format. So by the time I stumbled upon it, it was 2006. So I hope that gives you enough.
Definitely does. And I have to tell you about this wild experience that I had regarding this story. And you may have heard of this at this point, in conversations that you're having outside of our conversations and emails and stuff. But when I first came across this story of this group and of Sharon Gans and of the horrific treatment that she put onto others and then others put onto others and so on, it was really through my communication with Spencer initially,
Mhm.
and the nature of the group, an esoteric hidden group, before you came forward and began sharing your stories in blog posts, in news articles, in memoirs. No one really had any idea of this group, really. And like Spencer says in the opening of his book, we were hidden, we had to be. If somebody was to ask, well, where does this group take place? Well, we couldn't tell you because it's, different buildings, different times. So I was really intrigued by Spencer's story and experiences of New York.
Mhm.
And then he introduced me to you, and we began talking. And your experiences were kind of the follow on to New York City.
Yeah.
So when Sharon Gans and Alex Horn landed in New York City and opened up their Odyssey study group, a few years later branched out into Boston and you became involved. And I didn't really know much about the beginnings of the Odyssey study group other than what you and Spencer were able to tell me. So I was in this interview, which will have released by this point, and I was speaking to an author named Molly Salons, who's written a fictional book about her experiences in a cult. She's taken influences from her experiences and put them in a fictionalized piece. And it felt really familiar when I was reading the book, parts of it. And I couldn't really put my finger on why. And in our interview, Molly said something to me about certain people that I have been able to connect between yours and Spencer's stories. Same personality type, same type of language, same type of characteristics. And
Mhm.
then she mentioned something about New York City, and all of a sudden I had this wild moment where I was like, Molly, can I just ask you, when you talk about this person, are you talking about Alex Horn? And she was just like, I can't tell you if you're correct, Casey. And it was like all of a sudden these pieces all clicked together. It was the most incredible thing because it made so much sense. And all of a sudden there was the first piece of this puzzle.
Yes.
The beginnings of the Odyssey study group and what it was like for individuals being recruited and indoctrinated in that part of the country, then Spencer's story in New York and your story in Boston, and all of a sudden we've got this full circle picture. So I know that Molly's mentioned that you've been in touch with one another
Think
since
about,
she has, yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
how's that for you, hearing all about that part of this wider picture?
Um, well, at this point, it is simply fascinating to me to find out what the history was and also what it morphed into, by the time the new millennium came along and I meet my new friend, quote unquote, Lisa, I mean, the California 1960s, 70s version was, at least in Boston, they think, again, I think this was different in New York, but so much more insidious and less violent, less physically violent. I think the psychological violence, it takes longer, but I think the result is the same, right? But I didn't see physical violence or sexual violence in my experience. So it's just one really fascinating for me to talk to her because I was asking her, was it really? I mean, her book, which I've read and is quite good, by the way. Um, it takes it to a higher, it ups the drama, right? But it was still pretty representative of what was going on, right? And for me, the theme, Casey, is I didn't know what the fuck I was in. If I had known, right? Like if I'd been like, oh, back in the 1970s, the leader of this group was systematically raping women, and that they were like pitting up men against each other to physically fight as part of the teaching. I would have been like, I don't think so. you know, like, and I think it comes back to one of those things that I think is true for any former member. Like, you leave the group and you're like, I had no idea what I was participating in, giving money to, giving time to, giving focus, giving energy to, you know? So that's the shocker that keeps popping up. And I think that's a shocker in a good way because it reminds me that people in the world exist who will deceive to that level and betray to that level.
We see it all around us all of the time in every type of environment, workplace, family environments, and then hidden secret groups that nobody knows about until decades after they've been running, abusing, exploiting, conning individuals. And I think aside from the intrigue and fascination that comes with how is that possible? How is it that nobody knows about these things? There is, of course, all of the methods around coercive control that go into making that possible. And that makes me more interested. So it's like this big cycle of trying to understand, but also finding the whole thing interesting. And you joined in 2006. So at this point, there is access to some type of modern technology. It's not as advanced, anywhere near as advanced in the early 2000s, of course, as it is today. But because of the nature of the group, nobody was going to be writing about any of this stuff until the late sort of 2010s, coming up to 2020 odd. So I don't know how anybody, even in the early 2000s, would have had a chance of really understanding what this group was and avoiding it. So could you just please give the listeners an overview once more of how you came to begin this misadventure, what your kind of overview a time was like within the group, and then how you eventually decided to leave?
Okay, yes. So the misadventure began with I'm using air quotes here, chance meeting with a woman at Whole Foods who just happened to strike up a friendly conversation with me. Woman was there with her husband and two children, by the way. Um, and by the end of the friendly conversation, said, "It's been so much fun talking with you. We should get together sometime." We exchanged phone numbers over the course of, I don't know how many months it was, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. We quote unquote developed a friendship. um, at a certain point, she invited me to meet her other friends. And I forgot to mention that, of course, I was in all kinds of emotional crisis at the time. So, a prime candidate. And Meeting other friends became going to classes, again, air quotes, twice a week. Um, it was quite formal as opposed to like what I pictured when she said, "I'd like to introduce you to other friends," which was like a potluck at somebody's house. um, and then, twice a week kind of expands into, "Oh, and we're doing this project. So can you come in on the weekends?" As with any other cult, it begins this kind of love bombing and excitement and new ideas, because this was a school and it simply called itself school. There was no real name. This was, the iteration of this group at this point was simply called school. I believe that was because you could Google other names and find, at that point in '06, you could find some information. Um, so I would say like 2 years in, 2.5 years in, when the love bombing is over. In fact, the honeymoon, really, the door slammed one day. And I was not functioning very well. I wasn't functioning very well when I went in. So, as you can imagine, 2 years into like gaslighting and being lied to and manipulated, and, all for the sake of this strange, esoteric, evolutionary school. Um, I was really pretty miserable and not functioning and really falling apart. And at that point, of course, I was ready to go out and make new friends because that was really the whole point, right? Like, now you get to go make new friends and to grow the group, because it's just like any other cult, right? And then so I was in for a total of 5, but at that point, I was falling apart more and more and more. And at a certain point, I knew it wasn't going to last, because I was miserable and, couldn't even like keep a schedule, couldn't keep a job, couldn't think straight, honestly. I was so riddled with um, cognitive dissonance that my mind was just shredding itself. And at that point, husband steps in, husband who is not in the group, let me be clear about that, and says, "Are you sure this group is not manipulating you?" And I said to myself, at the time, I didn't know what to say to him, but to myself, I was like, I have no idea. I don't know my ass from my elbow at this point. Um, so over the course of a weekend, after some drama about my husband, which, they cults don't like pesky spouses who ask questions, right? They don't like that. I decided to leave. But then after I left, it was pretty clear to me, I think relatively quickly, I started stepping back from it and not being influenced by it and thinking, oh my God, like what the fuck? I mean, I was letting these quote unquote teachers micromanage. I'm an adult and they're telling me, how to manage my relationship with my husband, how to find a job, what jobs I should take, who I can talk to, what I can talk about. And From then, I became just obsessed with the whole phenomenon. So, again, I hope that answers your question.
During my conversation with Spencer, he mentions at certain points he's not totally sold on the idea of school to begin with.
Hmm.
And after a session or two, he has this life-changing event happen that brings him from being down in the dumps to maybe actually I'll be okay. And it was linked to his career.
Hmm.
And you mentioned that you were going through a lot of emotional difficulties. You were at a low point in your life as well. The chapter that shows the interaction that you have with Lisa in Whole Foods, it's painted so perfectly. It's almost like you're there, especially when Lisa uses her child as part of her initiation to converse with you, which I thought was particularly predatory. And Spencer's mind kind of shifted after this happened, and he'd just joined school and thought, oh, actually maybe it's because I've joined school that these really great things are happening. Did you have a moment like that affirmed your decision to be in that group?
Um, I can't think of one particular moment at right now. I was aware of my cognitive dissonance from start to finish, and in fact have really kind of parsed out these two. There's the inner starry eyed believers who are like, this is fabulous, and the inner skeptics were always poking. Um, and even when Lisa talked to me at the Whole Foods, I was initially very skeptical and suspicious because that doesn't happen in Boston. It's not. It's not the kind of place where shopkeepers and fellow customers are yakking with each other. However, nothing was really working in my life, and it's so stereotypical, but honestly, I was getting ready to break up with someone. It was, lots of drama going on with this breakup right when I met her, and then so I met her. I think it was like May or June, something like that. I go to my first quote unquote class, I think in July or August of the summer. And then in the fall, I started dating my current husband and I found a job. Um, and I felt like everything was turning around. And so I thought, oh, well, there's really something to this. I credited the group, right? Because my luck started to change and I started being able to adult, which honestly, adulting was always confounding to me. And I'm going to point to the book for a second. I kind of equate that to this concept I've come up with called the gentle soul, where, I grow up like a really empathic, creative, spacey kid. And my entire life, everyone's telling me that I'm too sensitive, I think too much, I'm too emotional. And so I didn't have any confidence. Like when you grow up without confidence, you're kind of set up and screwed. Um, so that was my big lesson from, you know, again, stumbling into this group. I'm sorry. Am I getting off topic here with your
No,
question?
not at all. I love this. There's no way to know whether those things in your life would have changed anyway,
Hmm.
whether you would have found yourself kind of stumbling into stability with or without school? And of course, that's the big hypothetical question, isn't it? And Chris Shelton always says you can't live your life in hypotheticals. I imagine that's something that individuals that have left cultic environments do a lot with their own minds. If only I hadn't, or if only I did. So Chris Shelton says you can't live in hypotheticals. And in The Gentle Souls Revolution, your memoir, that cognitive dissonance is present in the book as well. It's present in your writing. As you go through your experiences and you tell the reader about things that are happening, there is always a little part in the writing that's like, well, that's strange, and I'm not sure about that. And oh, do I really want to believe that? And what I what I think I even called back to in our first talk was how incredible your husband was. He was never pushy. He was never forceful. He never was like, you're in a cult. Just kind of little subtle questions, and then just, leaving you to kind of think things over. Like, is this what's best for you? Are you getting the best that you could be out of this group? And I just love that. I was just like, yes, that champion all the way through.
I do want to say we did have a number of fights during the Christmas season, which in the book, you'll see there's a chapter called the Christmas Party. So he did lose his temper every once in a while, but overall, he was incredibly patient with me, and that's I think I might have left anyway, but I would have been far worse off in the group far longer without this, you know, a solid person in my life. Um, so yeah, I'm sorry if you were heading towards a question.
No, I was just recalling parts of the book that have stuck with me.
Mhm.
And your husband's presence throughout your journey was one of those things. And I don't know what relationship would sustain such a dynamic given the nature of school, because you're not supposed to tell anyone about it. You're not supposed to go into details.
Yeah.
After you leave school, you're not supposed to talk to anyone for a certain amount of time on the phone, give anyone a lift home and talk to them in the car. Like, there's like this ceremonial
Yes.
silence that takes place,
Yeah.
which of course is information control, stops you
Mhm.
from critically thinking, and all of those things that you detail so well in your book. So what relationship, your husband must have had a very you must have had a very trusting marriage even then, for him not to be like, where is she all the time and who's she spending all her time with?"
Yeah, I mean, my husband is my best friend. There's no reason for us not to trust each other. But the other thing is, honestly, I broke the rules right away and told him I didn't tell him details, but I did say, like, I go to this thing twice a week. And at the time, we're newly dating. And he said, look, if it helps you, it's none of my business. So I think this is actually a really important thing to talk about, that not only do cults fuck with their membership, they leverage trust. They leverage trust between me and my spouse, because my spouse is like, well, I don't want to take this away from you. I want to support you. Um, and in the meantime, the longer you're in the group, the more spouse becomes the enemy. Um, So, something, Casey, if you had a question, I completely forgot because I went off on that tangent, but go ahead.
It's when we talk about cognitive dissonance, and then we look at the difference between your husband saying, if it helps you, then I'm glad you have it, and then the group with Robert saying things like, just divorce him, get rid of him, he's no good for you. Like, the difference in those two approaches, that tells you everything about which aspect of your life is toxic and which is supportive, in just those
Exactly.
two in just those two parallels, which I think is really interesting.
Yep, exactly. That kind of bizarre carnival funhouse, not so fun distorted mirror, of one person saying, "Are you sure this is okay for you? You seem like you're not doing so well. I can see you, right?" And another person saying, "You need to leave your husband because he's trying to control you," right?
Oh my goodness, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the honeymoon period wore off pretty quickly and then one day the door slammed. Was there a particular memory or notable event that you can call on where you thought, "Oh, this might not be what I thought it was going to be"?
There are so many, Casey, and some of them are in the book. I think, in a way, I had that sense all along, but I think particularly poignant. There, I'm going to jump to when they want me to go out and recruit people, even though there are some other scenarios that really stayed with me because even when I was what I like to call in my cult coma, I snapped out for a second and thought, wow, that was really fucked up. Um, but the making new friends thing, I think, although I was really, really conflicted about it and did try, I could never swallow that pill because I don't believe in proselytizing. I've always found it offensive. Um, and it followed me around all day. And that's really what made my cognitive dissonance just amp up, screaming sirens. Like part of me was like, I am being a good doobie. I must speak to this person at the Whole Foods who's, buying tofu or something because maybe they need school because they have this grand idea that they'll never be able to implement without quote unquote the help. I mean, all these groups use the word the help, right? Like, and there's another part of me that was like, you know what? I don't fucking want to talk to this person. Right? I don't have my own life at that point. So I guess, and you know what, that jumps to mind for me another really specific moment where, so I think in these groups, if you're, I hate to use the terminology of joining a cult because I feel like just nobody fucking joins a cult, right? But um, people who stumble in get duped into, as I did, there's always like some kind of a defect that you're dealing with. And mine happened to be like around work and money and not being able to hold down a job. And, there's a whole drama around them helping me find work that I always lose. I always end up getting fired. Um, and so one day I'm driving to a job that I hate, which is writing copy for a software company. And, honestly, we used to wonder at the company, me and the designer, the website designer used to wonder, like, are they actually selling software here? What's happening? um, and I hated the job. I hated the environment. And I remember thinking to myself specifically, I'm stuck in traffic on Route 95, commuting to the job. My life is no longer my own. That was a pretty poignant moment. I have traded in who I am for the guidance of this group that has secret, ancient, esoteric knowledge, but somehow I feel like shit. That, you know, should have been a screaming silent siren red flag to leave, but I did not at that point.
That is the end of part 1 of this mini-series on the Odyssey study group Revisited. To find out more about Esther's work, you can follow the links in the episode description, or to get in touch with me, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.